The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never seen such chaos. Representatives from 12 different worlds sat around the massive circular table, their voices rising in panic and desperation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with fear as translators worked overtime to convert the babble of alien languages into something everyone could understand. Ambassador Thylan of the Mirathi people stood at the center of it all, his pale blue skin almost glowing under the harsh emergency lighting. His 6 eyes were fixed on the holographic display floating above the table, showing images that made even the most hardened diplomats look away in horror. 3 entire star systems reduced to nothing but floating debris and ash. Billions of lives snuffed out in a matter of weeks. The Kepler system had been first, home to the gentle Altari, a species known throughout the galaxy for their beautiful crystal gardens and peaceful philosophy. The Dracor Armada had arrived without warning, their black ships blotting out the stars. Within 72 hours, every Altari city was burning. Those who survived the initial bombardment were loaded into cargo ships like cattle, destined for slave markets in the Outer Rim. Next came the Vegan colonies, 3 prosperous mining worlds that had supplied rare metals to half the galaxy. The Dracor didn't even bother with occupation this time. They simply strip-mined everything of value and left the planets as barren rocks spinning in space. The few survivors spoke of Dracor soldiers who seemed to enjoy the destruction, laughing as they tore apart families and burned entire cities for sport. The third system, Proxima 7, had been the worst. A research station filled with scientists from dozens of species, all working together on projects to benefit the entire galaxy. The Dracor had taken their time there, using the researchers as test subjects for new weapons and torture techniques. The recordings that managed to escape before the station's destruction were so horrific that the Council had classified them immediately. Commander Vexel, whose crystalline body normally shimmered with soft light, was now flickering like a broken lamp. His species communicated partially through color changes, and right now he was broadcasting pure terror to anyone who knew how to read the signals. "The Dracor are not like any enemy we have faced before," he said, his voice crackling through the universal translator. "They do not want territory or resources or even revenge. They seem to enjoy causing pain for its own sake." Around the table, other representatives nodded grimly. The Zephyrians, who looked like tall, graceful birds, had their feathers pressed flat against their bodies in distress. The aquatic hydrons were changing colors rapidly, cycling through blues and greens that indicated extreme anxiety. Even the normally stoic granite people, living rock formations from the heavy gravity worlds, were showing stress fractures in their stone faces. "Our fleets are designed for protection and peacekeeping," continued Vexel. "We have police ships, not warships. The Dracor cut through our defenses like they were made of paper. Their tactics are ruthless, their weapons are designed for maximum suffering, and they show no mercy to civilians." The truth was painful but undeniable. For over 300 years, the Galactic Council had worked to create a civilized society among the stars. Wars had been replaced with trade disputes settled by arbitration. Military forces were reduced to small peacekeeping units. Weapons research had been banned in favor of medical and scientific advancement. They had built a utopia, but utopias were fragile things. Ambassador Thylan cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Everyone knew what he was about to say, but no one wanted to hear it. "There is one species we have not contacted," he said slowly. "One group that might be able to match the Dracor's brutality." The silence stretched on. Finally, a young Altari delegate, one of the few survivors from the Kepler system, spoke up. "You mean the humans?" The word came out like a curse. Every being in the room had heard the stories. Humans were the newcomers to galactic society, discovered only 50 years ago on a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. Their first contact with galactic civilization had gone badly. When peaceful exploration ships had approached Earth, the humans had immediately opened fire. It took weeks of careful negotiation to establish that this was their normal response to the unknown. The stories that emerged from human history had shocked the civilized galaxy. These creatures had spent their entire existence at war with each other. They had invented weapons capable of destroying their own planet multiple times over. Their entertainment consisted of watching simulated violence, their sports involved physical combat, and their art was filled with themes of conflict and death. They refused our offer to join the council, reminded the Hydran representative, her gills fluttering nervously. They said they were not ready for peaceful coexistence. Perhaps, said Thylan grimly, peaceful coexistence is not what we need right now. The debate that followed was fierce but brief. The Granite people argued that bringing humans into the conflict would be like fighting fire with molten lava. The Zephyrians worried that humans might be even worse than the Dracor. The Hydrans pointed out that humans had never shown any interest in galactic affairs before, but in the end, the math was simple. 3 star systems were already gone. Intelligence reports suggested the Dracor were massing for attacks on 5 more systems. The Council's combined fleets had proven useless against their enemies' superior tactics and ruthless efficiency. They needed someone who could match the Dracor's brutality, someone who understood violence in ways that civilized species could not. When the vote was called, every hand, claw, tentacle, and appendage rose in agreement. They would contact Earth. They would ask the humans for help. And they would pray that their cure would not prove worse than the disease. As the session ended and representatives filed out to make the necessary preparations, Ambassador Thylan remained behind, staring at the holographic display. The images of destroyed worlds flickered before his eyes, and he wondered if they were about to unleash something even more terrible upon the galaxy. But what choice did they have? The Draco were coming and someone had to stop them, even if that someone turned out to be monsters themselves. Admiral Taemin had been expecting this call for months. Standing on the command bridge of the Iron Phoenix, Earth's most advanced battleship, he watched the alien transmission for the 3rd time. The holographic faces that appeared before him were unlike anything most humans had ever seen. Blue-skinned beings with multiple eyes, crystalline creatures that sparkled like living diamonds, and bird-like entities with feathers that changed color as they spoke. But despite their strange appearances, their expressions were universally familiar. Fear, desperation, the kind of raw terror that transcended species barriers. The message was simple enough. Something called the Dracor Armada was sweeping through their peaceful galaxy, destroying entire civilizations without mercy. The aliens had tried everything: diplomatic solutions, economic sanctions, even their own military forces. Nothing had worked. Now they were turning to humanity as a last resort. Taemin found that part almost amusing. For 50 years, these same aliens had kept humanity at arm's length. They had called humans primitive, violent, and unfit for civilized galactic society. Earth's applications to join their galactic council had been politely but firmly rejected multiple times. The official reason was always the same. Humans were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too dangerous. Now those same qualities made humanity their only hope. Lieutenant He Jin looked up from her analysis station, her fingers dancing across holographic displays as she processed the tactical information the aliens had provided. "Sir, I've gone through all their military data. These aliens have impressive technology ships that can travel faster than light, energy shields that can deflect asteroids, weapons that can crack planets. But everything is designed for defense." She brought up a 3-dimensional battle map, showing how the aliens typically fought. Their ships moved in perfect formations, like dancers performing a rehearsed routine. They targeted only military vessels, carefully avoiding civilian areas. Even when it put them at a tactical disadvantage, they followed something they called the Warfare Conventions, a set of rules that governed how civilized species were supposed to fight each other. "It's like they're playing chess while their enemies are playing street fighting," Yejin continued. "The Dracor don't follow any of these rules. They target civilians first to break morale. They use captured prisoners as human shields. They destroy entire planets just to send a message." Taemin studied the data with the eye of someone who had spent his entire life understanding conflict. The Dracor were certainly brutal, but they were still thinking like conventional military commanders. They used overwhelming force, terror tactics, and psychological warfare, but within predictable patterns. They were bullies on a galactic scale, and like all bullies, they had probably never faced someone willing to fight dirtier than they did. "What's their assessment of human military capabilities?" he asked. Hai-Jin pulled up another file, and Tai-Min could see her trying not to smile. "They classify us as a moderate threat with unpredictable tactical doctrine. They're particularly concerned about what they call our excessive willingness to accept casualties and our disregard for conventional military honor." That was diplomatic language for calling humans crazy. The aliens had studied Earth's history and been horrified by what they found. Humans were the only known species that had spent their entire evolutionary history at war with themselves. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet and then built enough of them to do it several times over. Their military tactics included concepts like mutually assured destruction, total war, and acceptable losses that made even hardened alien warriors uncomfortable. "Prepare the fleet," Tai-Min ordered. "Full combat loadout. And send a message to Earth Command. Tell them we're accepting the contract." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity as the human battle fleet prepared for deployment. The Iron. Phoenix was joined by 12 other warships, each one designed not for exploration or peacekeeping, but for one purpose: destroying enemies as efficiently as possible. As the ships loaded supplies and personnel, a small group of alien observers watched from a safe distance. They had been sent by the Galactic Council to monitor human preparations and report back on what they saw. What they witnessed left them increasingly disturbed. First came the conventional troops, human marines in powered armor that made them look like walking tanks, carrying weapons that fired projectiles at incredible speeds. The aliens used energy weapons that were precise and clean. Human weapons were designed to cause maximum damage and, frankly, maximum pain. Then came the specialists, chemical warfare experts, who brought sealed containers marked with symbols that the universal translator couldn't interpret, but which made the alien observer's skin crawl just looking at them. Psychological warfare units who loaded equipment. That seemed designed for purposes the aliens couldn't even imagine. But most disturbing were the small unmarked containers that even the human crew handled with extreme caution. The humans wore full protective gear when moving them, and several containers were placed in special isolation chambers that hummed with unknown energy. Captain So Young, commander of the assault carrier Crimson Dawn, noticed the aliens' increasingly pale expressions as they watched the loading process. She walked over to them with the confident stride of someone who had spent years in combat zones. "Something wrong?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "These weapons," stammered one of the Zephyrian observers, his colorful feathers now a sickly gray. "Some of them appear to be prohibited by galactic law." So Young's smile was cold and sharp as a knife. "Galactic law doesn't apply to Earth. We never signed your treaties." She gestured toward the ships being loaded with enough firepower to level a small moon. "You asked for our help against an enemy that doesn't follow rules. Well, congratulations. You're about to see what happens when humans don't follow rules either." The alien observers exchanged worried glances. They had thought the Dracor were the most terrifying force in the galaxy. But watching humans prepare for war, they began to wonder if they had just invited something even worse to their crisis. As the fleet finished loading and prepared to depart, Tai-Min stood on his bridge and reviewed the mission parameters one more time. The aliens wanted the Dracor stopped. They wanted their people saved and their civilization preserved. They were going to get exactly what they asked for. The question was whether they would be able to live with the methods humanity would use to deliver it. The jump to hyperspace engaged, and the human fleet disappeared into the void, carrying with them the hopes and fears of an entire galaxy. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system with an eerie silence that made the watching aliens shiver. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic positioning for maximum visual effect. The 13 human warships simply appeared, black against the stars, like predators emerging from tall grass. Admiral Tai-Min stood on the bridge of the Iron, Phoenix, studying the tactical display with the calm focus of a chess master examining the board. The Dracor Armada was spread out before them in textbook military formation. 57 ships arranged in 3 perfect waves, their massive dreadnoughts at the center, surrounded by smaller support vessels. It was an impressive sight, the kind of overwhelming force that had crushed a dozen civilizations. The Drakor had clearly expected this moment. Intelligence reports suggested they knew the humans were coming. Their ships were positioned to demonstrate maximum firepower, with their largest vessels prominently displayed. It was classic intimidation tactics, designed to make enemies surrender before the first shot was fired. "They're showing off," observed Lieutenant He Jin from her station. "Trying to scare us with their numbers." Taimin almost smiled. The Drakor were still thinking like conventional military commanders. They believed in the old rule that the biggest, most impressive force usually won. They had studied human history and probably expected Earth's fleet to engage in the kind of massive, straightforward battles that had characterized human warfare. For centuries, they were about to learn that humans had evolved far beyond simple brute force. "Open all communication channels," Taimin ordered quietly. "Begin Phase 1. What happened next would be talked about in horrified whispers across the galaxy for generations to come. Instead of the usual military communications demanding surrender or stating terms, the human fleet began broadcasting something entirely different. At first it sounded like random noise, static, and interference, but as the alien observers listened more carefully, they realized what they were hearing. Screams. Human screams, but not of fear or pain. These were different. They were the sounds humans made when they were enjoying themselves. Battle cries from ancient Earth wars, mixed with laughter, mixed with sounds that the universal translators couldn't even process, because no civilized language had words for them. The broadcasts weren't random. They were carefully selected recordings from human history. The sound of Viking raiders charging into battle, screaming with joy as they swung their axes. Audio from World War II fighter pilots whooping with excitement as they dove their planes into enemy formations. Recordings of human soldiers throughout history who had found something in combat that went beyond duty or survival. The Drakor fleet, which had been maintaining perfect formation, began to show signs of confusion. Their ships started moving, in small uncertain patterns. Communications traffic between their vessels increased dramatically. "Drakor formation is showing stress patterns," reported Commander Huan Su, his voice eerily calm as he monitored enemy communications. "Their discipline is wavering. They're requesting orders from their command vessel, but their commanders seem unsure how to respond." The psychological warfare was just beginning. Human ships began moving in patterns that violated every known principle of space combat. Instead of maintaining formation or positioning for maximum firepower, they scattered like a pack of wild animals. Some ships accelerated directly toward the enemy fleet at full speed, as if planning suicidal ramming attacks. Others moved in seemingly random directions, making it impossible for the Drakor to predict their intentions. Most disturbing of all, several human vessels were broadcasting what appeared to be damage reports and distress calls. But when Drakor ships moved to investigate these apparently crippled vessels, they discovered the reports were fake. The damaged human ships were actually laying traps, using their apparent weakness to lure enemy vessels into vulnerable positions. The alien observers aboard the human fleet watched all of this with growing horror. They had expected a military engagement, with clear sides and understandable objectives. Instead, they were witnessing something that felt more like watching predators hunt prey. "This isn't how civilized species fight," whispered the Zephyrian observer, his colorful feathers now completely pale with shock. "They're not fighting like soldiers," added the crystalline Vexel representative, his normally steady light flickering with distress. "They're fighting like they enjoy it." The Mirathi observer, whose peaceful species had never engaged in warfare, was the most disturbed of all. "Sir," he said to Admiral Taimin, his voice barely audible, "what are they? What are you?" Taimin turned to look at the alien, and for the first time since the battle began, his expression showed something other than calm calculation. For just a moment, there was something in his eyes that made the observer step backward involuntarily. "We're what you made necessary," Taimin said quietly. "For 300 years you built a galaxy based on rules and honor and civilized behavior. You created a paradise where violence was controlled and war was regulated. You made sure everyone played by the same rules." He gestured toward the tactical display, where human ships continued their chaotic, unpredictable dance around the increasingly confused Draco fleet. But what happens when someone refuses to play by those rules? What happens when you face an enemy that doesn't care about honor or civilians or any of the conventions that hold civilized society together? Taemin's smile was cold and sharp. You call us. You call the species that never learned to be civilized in the first place. The Drakor were beginning to panic now. Their perfect military formation was breaking apart as individual ships tried to respond to threats that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some vessels were trying to retreat to defensive positions, while others were moving forward aggressively. But without coordination, their overwhelming numerical advantage was becoming meaningless. Phase 1 complete, reported Commander Huan Su. Enemy morale appears to be degrading. Their command structure is showing signs of breakdown. Taemin nodded. The psychological assault had worked exactly as planned. The Drakor had built their reputation on being the most ruthless force in the galaxy, but they were still thinking like military professionals. They understood brutality and overwhelming force, but they had never faced an enemy that seemed to treat warfare as entertainment. Begin Phase 2, he ordered. The real battle was about to begin, and the watching aliens were starting to realize that they might have made a terrible mistake in asking for humanity's help. The real battle began when the first human boarding pods launched from their ships like bullets fired from a gun. The Drakor had expected conventional space combat, ship against ship, with clean energy weapons and predictable tactics. Instead, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, humans who seemed to view warfare as an art form. Lieutenant Minsu commanded the first wave of boarding teams, and what his soldiers did aboard captured Drakor vessels would become the stuff of nightmares throughout the galaxy. The humans didn't simply eliminate enemy crew members and move on. They turned each captured ship into a psychological weapon designed to break the minds of anyone who discovered it. When the next Drakor patrol found their missing vessel, they discovered scenes that their military training had never prepared them for. Equipment had been arranged in patterns that seemed random, but somehow felt deeply wrong. Personal belongings of the crew were displayed in ways that suggested the humans had taken time to study each individual before whatever had happened to them. The genius of it was that the humans rarely left obvious evidence of violence. Instead, they created an atmosphere of dread that was far more effective than any amount of blood or destruction. Drakor warriors, who had conquered dozens of worlds without flinching, found themselves afraid to enter their own ships. Captain Yujin, commanding the assault carrier Crimson Dawn, had brought specialists that the civilized galaxy didn't even have names for. When her sonic weapons teams deployed their equipment, the effects were immediate and devastating. The devices didn't kill, they did something worse. They produced frequencies that resonated with Drakor brain chemistry, inducing a state of pure, unreasoning terror. Drakor soldiers who had faced death without fear found themselves cowering in corners, their minds overwhelmed by panic they couldn't control or understand. Some tried to surrender, but the sonic attacks made coherent thought impossible. Others simply abandoned their posts and fled, spreading their terror to anyone they encountered. "Sir, Drakor command vessel is attempting to coordinate a counterattack," reported Commander Huan Su from his monitoring station. Admiral Taemin studied the tactical display, watching as the enemy fleet tried desperately to regain some semblance of order. The Drakor commanders were experienced military professionals, and they were adapting to human tactics faster than he had hoped. "Time to escalate. Target their command vessel," he ordered quietly. "Let's show them what real monsters look like." What followed was perhaps the most disturbing display of the entire battle. Human fighter pilots, instead of engaging in normal combat maneuvers, began performing what could only be described as kamikaze runs. But these weren't desperate last-ditch attacks. They were calculated, precise strikes designed to achieve maximum psychological impact. The fighters would accelerate directly toward Drakor ships, broadcasting human laughter and war songs, only to veer away at the last possible second after delivering devastating close-range attacks. The effect was to make every Drakor gunner question whether the next human pilot would actually pull away, or simply ram their ship at full speed. Some didn't pull away. Sergeant Yunwu's commando team, had managed to capture a Draka communications array, one of the relay stations that allowed their fleet to coordinate across vast distances. Instead of simply destroying it, the humans did something far more creative. They began broadcasting. The transmission that went out to every Drakor ship in the system wasn't a demand for surrender or a military communication. It was a carefully edited compilation of human military history. Footage from Earth's most savage conflicts, showing not just the violence, but the expressions on human faces as they engaged in it. The aliens watching from their observation posts were horrified by what they saw. Humans throughout history hadn't just fought wars, they had documented them, studied them, and in many cases seemed to enjoy them. The footage showed soldiers from different eras and conflicts, but all with the same unsettling characteristic. They looked happy. "Turn it off," whispered the Marathi observer, but no one moved to comply. Even the aliens couldn't look away from the terrifying spectacle of humans at war. The effect on the Drakor fleet was immediate and devastating. These were warriors who had built their reputation on being the most ruthless force in the galaxy. They had committed atrocities that made civilized species shudder. But watching humans fight, they realized they were facing something beyond mere ruthlessness. The humans weren't fighting for territory or resources or even revenge. They were fighting because on some fundamental level, they were good at it and they knew it. Every tactic, every weapon, every strategy had been refined over thousands of years of constant warfare. This wasn't just their military, this was their culture. Several Drakor vessels simply turned and fled without waiting for orders. Others stopped responding to communications entirely, their crews apparently paralyzed by what they had witnessed. The legendary Drakor discipline, forged through centuries of conquest, began to crumble like sand. Captain So Young, monitoring the enemy fleet's communications, reported a development that surprised even the humans. "Sir, we're intercepting Drakor transmissions. They're not coordinating attacks anymore, they're warning each other about us." The tide of battle had turned not through superior numbers or better technology, but through something far more primitive and effective. Pure, calculated terror. The Drakor had built their empire on being the thing that other species feared. Now they had encountered something that scared them. By the time Admiral Taemin ordered the final phase of the attack, the Drakor fleet was already in full retreat. Ships that had never fled from any battle were racing toward the edge of the system, abandoning their positions and their mission without a second thought. The few vessels that remained fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but their coordination was gone. Individual ships were easy targets for human forces that moved like a pack of hunters, surrounding and overwhelming isolated enemies. When the last Drakor vessel jumped to hyperspace in panicked retreat, the silence that followed was deafening. The alien observers sat in stunned shock, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The humans had won, but the victory felt somehow wrong. This wasn't how civilized warfare was supposed to work. There should have been honor, rules, some sense that both sides were fighting for something noble. Instead, they had watched humans demonstrate why their species had been kept out of galactic civilization. They were effective, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying when unleashed. The question now was whether the cure had been worse than the disease. The silence that followed the battle was perhaps more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. Space itself seemed to hold its breath as the last Draka vessel disappeared into hyperspace, running like a scared animal from predators it had never imagined could exist. The Kepler system, which had been the site of one of the galaxy's most brutal conflicts just hours before, now floated in an eerie calm. Debris from destroyed ships drifted slowly through the void, but even that seemed subdued, as if the wreckage itself was afraid to make too much noise. Admiral Taemin stood on the bridge of the Iron Phoenix, watching his tactical display return to normal readings. No enemy signatures, no incoming threats. Mission accomplished. He turned to his communications officer with the same expression he might wear while ordering lunch. "Prepare the after-action report," he said calmly. "Standard format, list casualties, ammunition expenditure, and tactical effectiveness ratings." Lieutenant Hai-Jin looked up from her station, still processing what she had witnessed. "Sir, should we include details about the psychological warfare operations?" Of course, Taemin replied, as if the question surprised him. Those were our most effective tools. The data will be valuable for future operations. That was perhaps the most chilling thing about the entire situation. To Admiral Taemin and his crew, the horrific tactics they had employed weren't horrific at all. They were simply tools in a toolbox, methods to be evaluated based on their effectiveness rather than their moral implications. The sonic weapons that had driven enemy soldiers to madness were listed alongside conventional explosives. The psychological manipulation was documented with the same clinical precision as fuel consumption. In the observation areas of the human ships, the alien representatives sat in stunned silence. They had asked for help, and they had received it. The Dracor Armada, undefeated for centuries, had been broken in a matter of hours. Entire worlds had been saved from slavery and destruction. By any measure, this should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, they felt like they had witnessed something that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Ambassador. Thylin of the Mirathi was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. They saved us, he said, as if trying to convince himself that this was a good thing. Commander Vexel, whose crystalline form was now flickering with confused patterns of light, turned to look at him. Did they? He asked quietly. Or did we just trade one nightmare for another? The question hung in the air like a poisonous gas. The Draco had been monsters, certainly. They had enslaved entire civilizations, destroyed worlds for sport, and shown no mercy to anyone who stood in their way. But their evil had been straightforward, understandable. They were conquerors who wanted territory and power. The humans were something different. They had fought not for conquest or glory, but because they were good at it. They had employed tactics that went beyond mere warfare into something that felt almost like art, and most disturbing of all, they had seemed to enjoy it. The way they moved, whispered the Zephyrian observer, his feathers still pale with shock. It wasn't like watching soldiers, it was like watching predators play with their food. The Hydran representative, her aquatic form shimmering with distressed color changes, added her own observation. They documented everything, every tactic, every psychological operation, every method of inducing terror. They're going to study this battle and learn from it. That realization sent a chill through all of them. The humans hadn't just defeated the Dracor, they had treated the entire conflict as a learning experience. They would return to Earth with detailed records of what worked and what didn't, refining their methods for future use. Captain Dong-hyun of the human destroyer Midnight Strike appeared in the observation area with the quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize all human military personnel. He was of average height with an unremarkable face, but something in his eyes made the alien observers unconsciously step backward. The threat has been neutralized, he announced, in the same tone someone might use to report that a broken appliance had been fixed. Our mission parameters have been completed successfully. We'll be returning to our territory now unless you require further assistance. The offer of additional help should have been reassuring. Instead, it sounded like a threat. Ambassador Thylin managed to compose himself enough to respond. No, that won't be necessary. We appreciate your help. Dong-hyun nodded politely. The Council has our contact information if similar situations arise in the future. Earth's military is always interested in practical experience opportunities. Practical experience opportunities. He was talking about warfare, about the systematic destruction of enemy forces, as if it were a training exercise. The casual way he discussed violence made the alien's skin crawl. As the human fleet prepared to depart, the alien observers found themselves watching with a mixture of relief and terror. They were glad to see the humans go, but they were also acutely aware that these same ships, these same weapons, these same terrifyingly effective soldiers would still exist somewhere in the galaxy. The jump to hyperspace was as quiet and efficient as everything else the humans did. One moment the ships were there, dark silhouettes against the stars. The next moment they were gone, leaving behind only empty space and the lingering memory of what they were capable of. In the days that followed, as rescue ships arrived to help the liberated populations and repair crews began cleaning up the Debris, the full scope of what had happened, began to sink in. The Dracor armada was gone, not just defeated but psychologically shattered. Intelligence reports suggested that surviving Dracor forces were in complete disarray, their command structure broken, and their warriors afraid to engage in combat. But liberation came with a price that no one had anticipated. The freed populations, grateful as they were, had also witnessed the battle. They had seen what humans were capable of when unleashed. The nightmares weren't limited to the Dracor. When the Galactic Council reconvened weeks later, the debate was unlike anything in the organization's 300-year history. They had faced an existential threat and survived, but the cost of survival was forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of civilization itself. "We built our society on the assumption that violence could be controlled and regulated," said one representative. "We created rules for warfare, codes of conduct, civilized ways to resolve conflicts. We forgot that those rules only work when everyone agrees to follow them." Another delegate added grimly, "The humans never agreed to our rules. They never pretended to be civilized. When we needed someone to fight monsters, we had to call other monsters." The most disturbing realization was that it had worked. The human methods, horrific as they were, had been more effective than centuries of civilized military doctrine. In a matter of hours, they had accomplished what the galaxy's combined fleets could not achieve in years of conventional warfare. The debate continued. One question kept returning. What happened now? The Dracor were gone, but humanity remained. They had proven themselves to be the most effective military force the galaxy had ever seen, and they had done it using methods that violated every principle of civilized society. The galaxy was safe, but it would never be the same. They had learned that sometimes civilization could only be preserved by those willing to abandon it entirely. And that knowledge would haunt them for generations to come. In the end, the Council made a decision that satisfied no one but seemed necessary to everyone. They would not invite humanity to join galactic civilization, but they would not actively oppose them either. They would hope that Earth remained content in its isolation, and they would pray they never again faced a threat that required humanity's unique services. But deep down, every representative knew the truth. They had opened a door that could never be fully closed again.